Hi, welcome to another edition of Travel with Sean. I'm Sean, and today we're traveling around Denmark to various different churches. Um, and our first stop is at an ancient church called Faniaford Church in Faniaford, Denmark. The church has its origins at least to around 1250. This is the Fanefjord Church in Denmark, built approximately 1250. Inside, you can see that the ceiling is covered with paintings. These paintings are not for decoration or for art, but to tell Bible stories. Because before the Protestant Reformation of the 1530s, the Bible was in Latin and church service was in Latin. Even after that, a lot of people still did not know how to read. So these Bible stories painted on the ceiling and on the pillars help them understand, help them follow along with the sermon. The pulpit on our right was built in about 1645, and the altarpiece was built about 1634. The pew boxes date to about 1600. Getting back to the paintings, though, the oldest of them is right here on the chancel arch, the archway dividing the altar area from where the people sit. These date from about 1350 to about 1375. Now, after the Protestant Reformation in the mid-1530s, there was a movement where religious zealots were declaring different things to be vanity or to be sinful, and they had to get rid of it or cover them up. So all these paintings had to get covered up, and so they got covered with white paint. Now we see the ship on the left. That's significant because all Danish churches have a ship, at least one ship hanging in the church. And it's because during the Viking era, ships were really important for transportation and for marketing. But also, the Danish tradition is that the ship represents safe passage to heaven with Jesus as the ship captain. So now we're at the church in Vindeby, Marabou County on Lolland Island in Denmark. Now, this church is pretty typical of a lot of churches out here in Denmark. And you see the graveyard or the churchyard is mostly gravel, but it's also very carefully landscaped with hedges, a little bit of grass, some trees, and each of the graves are separated by hedges, or perhaps families. Perhaps it's separated by families. Now this church was built around 1300, and the first section to be built would be the nave, what's called the nave. That's the middle section. Then they would build the chancel, where the altar is. Then when they get more money, they build the bell tower. This door here is the entrance to the bell tower. That is where the bells are. And the bells in this church date from the 1750s. There are two bells, one from the 1750s, the other one from the 1580s. But then each church had two entrances. Actually, many had three entrances, excuse me. So this would be the men's entrance. Men would enter one side, the women would enter another side, and they would sit on opposite sides of the church. Where they sat inside the church, besides that, depended on their income, their wealth, their status in the community. Those of a higher income, higher wealth, higher status sit closer to the chancel, closer to where the altar is. They're more worthy to be next to God. That was the thought process. So the peasant farmers would be way in the back. But I said there were 3 entrances, and I mentioned 2. The third entrance would be at the chancel, and that is for the priest. The priest was a godly man, so he would not enter with the common people. For this church, it's hard to see where the priest's entrance was, but probably it was around here. The chancel, the altar area, known as the chancel, is on the other side of this wall. So it's likely the priest would have entered from here. On a rare circumstance, some churches may have the priest's entrance in back. Now, churches in Denmark, prior to the Protestant Reformation in the mid-1500s, were Roman Catholic. However, in Denmark, after they became Protestant and adopted the Lutheran Church, which is the official government religion in Denmark, has been since the Reformation. The only churches allowed in Denmark are Lutheran. But my point is that they still call their clergy priest, not pastor. Then on this side of the church, to the far left is the chancel, then is the nave, the women's entrance into the nave. So then this is the tower. And you see the shape of the tower. This is traditional in Denmark, as is the color. Many churches in Denmark have the red tile roof, ceramic tiles, and white walls. And I was saying this church was built in the 1300s. You can see here the tower was built in 1377. And the tower was the last part to be built. Now, the engraver was telling me also, prior to the Reformation, there was a big scandal in this church. It used to be a very popular church. A lot of farmers in the area, and they worshipped here. But 2 men had a dispute over land right here in the doorway. And here at church, the one man killed the other. The people were ready to forgive him as long as he paid compensation to the family as required by law. He refused. He was so upset about this argument they were having, he refused to pay the compensation to the family. The family was so upset about this, they moved away, and many other parishioners were sympathetic to the family and also moved away. Now, he said that this church remained empty for hundreds of years because of that. And it wasn't until maybe the 1800s that they reopened. Now let's talk about the churchyard a little bit. I already mentioned, as you can see, it's very well landscaped, nice and neat. And I was talking with the engraver earlier. The engraver in America would probably be called the sexton or the groundskeeper. The engraver sounds like the person, when I first heard that name, I thought engraver, somebody who engraves something onto some jewelry. Then as I thought about it, the engraver sounds like somebody who digs the graves. They don't do either one of those. The engraver takes care of the churchyard. They take care of the graves. All churches are owned by Denmark, by the country, by the government. And the government pays the salary for the engraver. And the government pays the salary for the priest and assigns what priest will work where. Or at least perhaps maybe that's the job of the bishop to assign the priests. But the point is that they work for the government, and they're paid for it. They're paid by the government. Now, when somebody is buried here, they have to pay for 30 years of burial, which is approximately 40,000 kroner, which equates to roughly $6,000. And after 30 years, the family is asked if they want to renew. Now, I'm not sure, I wasn't clear if it's renew for another 10 years or renew for another 30 years. But either way, if the family does not renew the lease, then it's the engraver's responsibility to remove the headstone. And now that 30 years have passed, that grave is available for another deceased member of the parish. Now, some people will choose to be cremated and then have their ashes buried here. That's a lot cheaper than a whole body burial. And then they only have to pay for 15 years, 10 or 15 years. And after 15 years, if the family does not renew, then they can bury somebody else in that grave. But what the engraver was telling me is that nowadays, because of this constant expense, a lot of people are choosing to be cremated and having their cremation remains scattered in the sea. Or maybe the family will keep them at home. Now we're at another church, very similar to the last one we're at. This is in a town called Uteruslo, approximately 4 kilometers away from Vindeby. And again, you can see distinctly that there are 3 parts. Here's the nave. And then they would build a chancel where the altar is. The nave is where the people sit. When they could afford it, they built a chancel with an altar and a fancy background behind the altar. But then when they had more money, they built a bell tower. And then this is the door to the bell tower. This would have been the men's entrance, which is now the main entrance. Over here you can see a gray door, and that would have been the priest's entrance directly into the chancel. Now we're inside the church at Utzlø. And if you look to the left, what looks like a shelf, this was the women's entrance. And it would have gone to the floor. And there would have been fewer pews on this side. Look to the right, it's a taller entrance for the men. Now, one interesting feature you will notice, well, you might not notice right away, but I'd like to bring to your attention, is this boat, ship. All the churches we've been in Denmark have a ship hanging from them. Now, the pulpit is pre-Reformation, probably from the 1300s. So here's the stairs where the priest would have walked up to the pulpit. Here's the altar with a fancy back piece. And all these churches have a semicircle altar rail in front of the altar to accommodate more people than a straight altar rail. Another thing I find interesting about all these churches, the parish churches all have a menorah. This is part of the Jewish tradition, not Christian. Although Christianity stems from Judaism, but still, I have not found anybody who can give me an explanation for why they have a menorah, other than it's tradition. You see, this looks like a hand-carved altarpiece, probably from the 1500s or maybe as far back as the 1300s. The baptismal fonts around here all came from Sweden. And these would have been around 1300 or early 1300s. I mentioned earlier that the wealthier you were, the closer you sat to the front. Now, here we have a pew box where all the rest of the pews are open. So that again tells me that this is somebody who is of a higher status, wealthier status. And we see names on both sides. Roskranze, Gillenstene. And likewise to the other side, looks like Davide. So Davide or David, family, or one person. Pappenheim. Now, alternatively, it could be somebody by the name of Der, from Pappenheim. This part of Denmark is very close to Germany. And until the 1800s, this was, I don't recall if Germany ruled this part of Denmark or Denmark ruled northern Germany. Either way, there's a connection between this part of Denmark and Germany. They were one country. Northern Germany, I should say. So again, we have a pew box, and then we have open pews. And the people sitting in these pews, as we go further back, they were not of as high a status or socioeconomic status as those that would sit up here. Thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, give me a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe down below. Then you can be alerted to future episodes of Travel with Sean. Thanks again.